Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. This week, I thought we'd talk a little bit about the Ethics Commissioner and basically who he is and what he does in light of the big report that came out last week. For those of you who are aware, he came out with his report on the Double-Hyphen Affair, meaning the issue around Jody-Wilson Raybould and SNC-Lavalin. And he found that the Prime Minister had contravened Section 9 of the Conflict of Interest Act. So I figured we would take a minute and just kind of unpack all of this and give us a grounding in who he is and why his report matters. So first of all, his full title is actually the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner. We call him Ethics Commissioner for short, but in reality, his job has actually very little to do with ethics. Because we don't really have any kind of legislative ethical guidelines for MPs. What we do have is the Conflict of Interest Act, as well as numerous other, there's the Accountability Act and so on, but most of what his job entails is statutory interpretation of the Conflict of Interest Act. So he needs to ensure that all MPs submit all of their any kind of financial dealings or whatnot to ensure that they are above board and so on. So he's the person who kind of signs off on that and ensures that they don't get themselves into conflicts, such as if they have family members who are in certain corporations or if they have close ties with other ones. The most famous ones we can think of in recent years were, for example, Dominic LeBlanc and the Irving family in New Brunswick. He's got close ties with them, and so he had to ensure that there are basically safeguards in places so that he's not making any decisions in cabinet that relate to the Irving family. So those are the kinds of things that the commissioner is supposed to be looking at. In terms of who the commissioner is, he's what's known as an officer of parliament. So that means that he reports to Parliament as a whole and not to just the government. In this case, his role is only to the House of Commons. The Senate has their own separate legal ethics officer because they have their own separate ethics code. The previous Conservative government, when they came into office and were making these sweeping ethics and accountability legislation reforms, tried to merge the two together, and the Senate basically said no way in hell. And so they dug their heels in and kept their own separate code and officer as a result of that. That's probably for the best because the roles of an MP and a senator are very different. And to try and put them under the same code, I think would invite more confusion and more problems than it would actually solve. So that's probably a good thing there. Other officers of Parliament include things like the Auditor General, the Lobbying Commissioner, the Information Commissioner, the Official Languages Commissioner, the Parliamentary Budget Officer. So that they're all basically, they report to Parliament as a whole, that they're not just acting for the government, they're acting for the benefit of all parliamentarians to ensure that the government is basically living up to the guidelines in legislation that they're supposed to around all of these different areas. So one of the things that we should think about in terms of this report that came out is what exactly the commissioner's role is here. And what happened in the timeline of things was that two MPs from the opposition party sent a letter to him saying, we think that there is a violation under Section 7 of the Act. Can you please investigate this? And the commissioner took it and said, no, Section 7 doesn't apply in a case like this. But what's different here is that he decided that rather than just telling them Section 7 doesn't apply and send them on their way, he thought maybe Section 9 applies, and so he would investigate on that basis instead. And that's kind of where this report stemmed from. What I think is interesting and we should probably talk a little more about generally is the fact that there's a number of legal minds, law professors and so on, who are basically questioning whether the commissioner's interpretation of Section 9 is actually correct or even legitimate, because Section 9 is about ensuring that people in government or public office holders don't make decisions that benefit their friends or their family or certain private interests. And the commissioner's reading was essentially that it was broad enough that it could encompass any private interest. So therefore, if the government was acting on behalf of a company like SNC-Lavalin, then that could constitute a conflict of interest there. But it's a bit problematic because what does this mean, for example, when a government decides to give a grant to a company based on whatever criteria, or they're doing some kind of a loan guarantee or something to that effect? Does that, under those criteria, then make it another kind of a conflict? And that, I think, is a question that isn't really being explored a lot in the media. There's been, so far as I can see, one piece from a law professor who kind of broke this down. And I think that that's kind of an important thing that we should be thinking about, that perhaps the finding was that he broke the act was possibly an error. That is not to say that there wasn't wrongdoing, because a lot of the stuff that he points to in the report does indicate that there was stuff that went on that probably shouldn't have. And we shouldn't let the fact that if the commissioner did overread his mandate, did kind of come to a conclusion that may have been erroneous in terms of that the act was broken, doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't wrongdoing. So we need to kind of keep those two thoughts in our head at the same time. One of the other things I found in the report that I also thought was kind of, I guess we'll say problematic, is that when the commissioner went looking for documents, the Privy Council, the clerk of the Privy Council basically said, no, these are cabinet confidences and you are not authorized to have them. And the commissioner said, well, implicitly my mandate says that I should. And it's that use of implicitly that I think is, again, kind of problematic, because it sounds a lot like he's trying to claim more powers than he has under the statute. And that's something that Parliament should have to decide whether or not they feel he deserves those powers or that they are necessary for his function and role. If in a case like this he's overreading his mandate, then perhaps Parliament needs to say, that's not really your job, that's not the job that we gave you, you're not, supposed to be investigating certain things on your own accord. Or they can decide that yes, they want to give him more powers because of whatever reason. Ostensibly, to prevent another incident like this from happening, although I don't see how that would be able to prevent one, but the logic, I'm sure, is there for someone. So I think that is another area where we should keep an eye out. The commissioner himself has said that he wants to get more powers to levy sanctions against MPs or ministers. And in that case, that would be another expansion of what he does. Most of his powers are in naming and shaming, which in politics can be a pretty powerful thing. He does have the ability to give small administrative penalties, which are basically fines, if, for example, an MP doesn't report something properly or on time. Our example of that was when Bill Morneau didn't properly report the structure of his French villa. He reported the villa. He didn't report the structure that it was in, because it's a kind of, you need to do as a sort of corporation there. And so he got hit with, I think it was a $500 fine for that. So that's kind of the powers that he has in terms of punishments. None of this is criminal code. It's conflict of interest guidelines in order to ensure that that MPs and ministers are not caught in conflicts that will make their decisions jeopardized or questionable. So that is again what we need to think of the lens of his powers in. Trying to come up with another system of penalties or levies that he can put against MPs, does that serve what the role is, which is to avoid conflicts? I'm not sure, but people are clamoring for it because we always like to see when politicians get punished for some reason or another. So those are things that we need to think about. So that's kind of how his office works and how it relates to this report, and things that we should be aware of as the discussion carries on over the next coming weeks, because this will be a recurring theme in the election, we can pretty much guarantee. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at Journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.